In this episode of the Endurance Podcast, we had a great guest, Professor Tadej Debevec, where we spoke about altitude training, how it works, the performance benefits, and how to maximize this type of training from a physiological and a nutritional perspective. We hope that you enjoy. Welcome to another episode of the Endurance Podcast with myself, Alex Rhodes, and Dr. Tim Podlogar. How are you doing this morning, Tim?
Hi, Alex. I'm doing great. It's sunny here after 3 days of just training.
Well, I've actually observed something just as we were setting up there, that since you've got a new job, I see you've upgraded your chair. What are you sat on there? You've now moved up in the world of desk chairs?
No. It's just that I work from home most of the time now. I bought myself an office chair.
So you must have got the storms pretty bad over there in Exeter now.
Oh yeah, it was horrible yesterday and the day before. Like I had barely any sleep because I thought that the windows would just end up in my room.
Yeah, it's got pretty crazy. I mean, you're more over to the west than me, and I'm kind of south in the centre of the UK. But the west got hit real bad. So yeah, I was kind of thinking of you guys over there, and I suppose that if for the listeners, if you haven't listened to our latest podcast, it was on indoor training, and what a perfect time. I'm guessing you spent some time on the indoor trainer this weekend for sure.
And yeah, like I did, but I had severe issues because I just couldn't get the humidity down. So it was kept being like in the high 70s in the house, even though the two dehumidifiers were on pretty much all the time, and it was just like horrible. And yeah, so I really struggled actually.
So I was going to ask you what tips, did you make any changes from our last podcast? Because Tom gave some great insight into indoor racing and being comfortable. I guess you just went to the extremes and ramped that humidity up, suffered indoors.
Well, no, I didn't do any changes. I was just doing some more Zwift racing actually, which is kind of fun, but I don't know if I like it. No.
Yeah, I mean, I spent some time indoors this weekend, and I guess a lot does come down to setup, like you say. I actually moved from being in the house to as not being out of the house as in outdoors, but we've got kind of a bit of an outbuilding, and I moved there, and the difference was just like day and night. And even though I was still indoors and I had the same fan and the same speed, just kind of the ventilation in the room made quite a bit of difference there, which, we're going to go and talk about different environments today, but it is quite interesting. And what Tom said last week about having the dehumidifier, I've had people message me since that podcast saying, I got a dehumidifier. It was amazing. I mean, I'm glad that some of that information has gone to use and just made people a bit more happier on the indoor trainer. But speaking of, I came across something this week, which was going totally off topic here, but whether you've come across it, and working in the world of nutrition, I was doing some work and some of the information was on there around a research survey around disease and disorders, and I came across a taste processing disorder. And whilst I'm going to hold my hands up, I've not looked into this, I don't understand what it is, but to me a taste processing disorder is that you either don't taste or you process it a bit differently, you taste something different. So it led me down the pathway that whilst we're having our coffee in the morning, do you taste coffee? Like, does your coffee taste like what I taste strawberries or carrots? Or, do we interpret that flavor a little bit differently? And I just got lost in this world of, do we even taste things the same, even though we call it the same thing? And is that why we like or dislike things?
I have no idea what you're talking about. It's like gibberish for me.
I'm gonna leave it. I'm gonna leave it at that. But that was just my mind was going into overload about how we could actually taste different things. But anyway, we like as the storms are coming in, as we're going into winter. Our last podcast was on indoor training, but that's kind of one side of that winter approach, and often around this time in the next few months, riders, recreational riders, professional riders, they'll be going off to camps, training camps, warm weather camps, altitude camps. And that's going to be our topic of discussion today. We've got a fantastic guest to share his knowledge with us. But I don't know about your perspective, Tim, but certainly if I look at going back 10 years in my sporting career and things, like altitude camps they're kind of a bit of a niche thing and not many people did them. Certainly my world of early elite sports, you'd get a rumor that the top few performers were doing some altitude training, a few altitude camps in there. Whereas now, whether it's just because I'm more immersed in the world or whether it's actually just becoming a bit more researched, a bit more understood, every team is going to altitude during the spring, or the world tour teams that might want to perform at altitude, they might actually just want to look at performance at sea level. We look in different sports like Christian Blumenfeld. You see a lot on social media about him at altitude, the Norwegians. Like, it seems to be the thing that you kind of have to do now. In that respect, what's your view on that?
Well, yeah, it's certainly something that like everyone is doing. And yeah, just like in a way it could be kind of a placebo, but no, I think there are like actual benefits there, especially if you do it right. And yeah, there is like a bit of a mismatch between the research because it's really, I feel like, difficult to do a good research at altitude, especially around training. And that's why we have like different findings between research studies, which today can, our guest today, which I haven't introduced yet.
Nearly let it slip.
Yeah, I can talk about more, but I think like definitely something that people find really important to do. And like from the sport I come from, which is like cycling, it's not just like some sea altitude performance gains, but it's mostly I think basically be able to sustain power output at a high level at altitude when you go over the mountain passes, because clearly, like, if you're not exposed to altitude whatsoever and you just suddenly come above 2,000 meters, you will suffer a lot.
And we do definitely see that, like in the Grand Tours, there's certain stages that will go above that 2,000 meter, and you do see changes in the front group perhaps on that climb, and some who some time that might be sat with the group are just their power output is hemorrhaging at times. So you can see why the Grand Tour guys kind of do it, but it also just seems like that it from either sea level performance or an adaptive perspective, and I'm sure we'll get into that. That it's got a little bit more traction. So a perfect time, which you've already half introduced our guest. We've got a great guest today. He's a professor at Ljubljana University. He did his PhD environmental physiology, altitude acclimation, athletic performance. I know he does a load of other amazing work. But outside of that as well, we know that he's a keen mountaineer, a mountain guide. He loves getting out in these extreme environments. So that gives him great insight into some of the things that he will discuss as well. So a huge warm welcome to Tadej Debevec. So I hope I pronounced that right, as we just discussed. But how are you this morning?
Yeah, thanks, Alex, and thanks, Tim, for the invitation. Yeah, I'm doing great and happy to be here today.
So, I mean, I've given probably what is a little bit accurate brief of yourself, but if you'd just like to tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, what you do, your past and current research, just so we get an idea of your background.
Yeah, so more or less, I'm a graduate of sports science essentially, and then as you mentioned, I did my PhD on more or less the topic of today's conversation of altitude training in an athletic performance scenarios. Later on, during the postdoc, I did a little bit of research on artificial gravity in activity simulation of space travel, which was exciting and also from a physiological point of view quite interesting to see the effects of inactivity as opposed to training, what we normally do in sports science. And then I came back, and nowadays I would characterize myself or my research is focused more or less on the topic of environmental exercise physiology. We do in the lab more or less work on different effects, acute or chronic, of exposure to high altitude or simulated altitudes. We do a bit of also thermoregulatory work on the heat and heat adaptations in athletes, etc. We try to combine a bit the research work and also a bit of applied work. So we try to do also some advising to performance teams, individuals, whatever. So it's really, and it's true that I'm really an outdoor person. So for me, it's a privilege essentially to be combining my interests with my professional work. And now I mostly do. I'm mostly employed at the university where I do full-time lecturing and research. And I'm also affiliated with the Institute Joseph Stefan, where we do a bit more of research work. And yeah, I mean, I wake up every morning and I'm happy to go to a great job in a way. Yeah. It's a nice life. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like as probably all three of us here, it's amazing. And I find it really, whether it's helpful or not, we all kind of gravitate to some of the sports and things that we understand. And like you say, outdoors. And you often find yourself thinking, well, I understand some of the theory and things, but while you're out there, you're like, what's actually happening to me? And you're experiencing these things that are going on. And it's the same. I mean, I know Tim does this because his social media feeds go wild whilst he's sat on the bike. But I do I do a lot of thinking while I'm on there as well about things that are happening and thought processing and what's going on. So it's great to hear that you live both sides of that world as well. But you also have, you and Tim know each other quite well. So where's the relationship come from there?
Well, probably he's the reason why I ended up being in research. So yeah.
So from my side, it was really exciting because not many undergraduate students or master students come to the lab and ask to do some tests or combine some, testing or trials. And Tim came to me, said, okay, I want to do this and this and this. And then I said, okay, wow, exciting. And then we started a bit of collaboration. We were also fortunate enough to have a bit of joint work 1 year at the Institute Joseph Stefan when Tim did a bit of postdoctoral work. It was unfortunate that it was COVID times, more or less at the time, so we were a bit limited on what we could do. But you could see from the beginning that Tim was excited about sports science and research and stuff, which is great to see. Sometimes, not very often you see it. Yeah, in students.
So you've got a good student and a good teacher here. So it looks like we're going to have a good conversation. Just before we move on to a little bit more in depth into like the altitude training and physiological changes, it must have been fascinating doing some of the I suppose the anti-gravity or the space stuff, because those are really unique, and it really made me think of some things just then that I came across, and this was years ago, but I don't know if either of you ever saw. It was called Doctors in the Death Zone, and it was like a series where they took that exercise bike. I think they got like 800. They were medical doctors, but I think they got like 800 meters below Everest summit, and they were doing some physiological tests. And it was just crazy watching like some of their numbers come out and being at like 80, 90 watts maximum, up there and really suffering. And you're like, whoa! Like if you have a perspective of being sat on a bike and what that actually is, it's like it can just have such profound effects. And I've done mountaineering in my time as well, and you can be a physically fit person, but you go up, high enough, and you go, man, I'm suffering here. Like, why am I so tired? And and it becomes really hard. So we're going to dive into what's really going on there. But I think for the purpose of the listeners, let's just kind of take it back, I suppose, to the basics, because it's quite a complex subject. But let's go back to the basics and think about endurance performance, physiology, what's really happening. Like, how can we take advantage of altitude training, and what are the benefits from a performance perspective?
Yeah, so this is a complex question, yeah. But I'll try to start with the basics, just that we know. Just that we understand why potentially altitude or hypoxia might be beneficial for performance purposes. Yeah, first we must understand that whenever we ascend to high altitude, there's a reduction in barometric pressure, which essentially reduces the partial pressure of oxygen, which then means, in simple terms, that there's less oxygen available for the metabolic processes in the body. And since we know that the majority of energy processes connected to exercise or muscle work is dependent on oxygen, it obviously has a profound effect on performance. Yeah, we have to realize that oftentimes also altitude research has been done for the last almost 150 years, more or less, and we know a lot about altitude basic physiological responses, but the majority of this research was actually done for more or less high or extreme altitudes, which is, let's say, above 3,000, 4,000 meters, etc., which is not that applicable to actual performance in a high performance sports scenario, because more or less all the training, as we'll discuss later on, and the competitions are done below 3,000 meters, up to, let's say, 2,500, which is what we term, like environmental physiologists, moderate to high altitude. And there are some basic physics and physiological effects of these altitudes, but they are not so profound as ones found at extreme altitude. So there's obviously lots of place for new research on the topic of connection of lower altitudes, applied levels of altitudes, and endurance performance. And maybe on the topic that you mentioned, Alex, about them being at 50 watts and being exhausted at high altitudes, it's really fascinating in a way that we now know that more or less the highest point on Earth, Mount Everest, is just barely manageable for an average person to live on top of that, because his oxygen consumption is more or less that of a resting metabolic consumption when you're stable at sea level. So it's really fascinating, and I think there were some calculations that if Everest would be 300 meters higher, on average, let's say, we wouldn't be able to reach it without supplemental oxygen, etc., which is, from a geophilosophical side of things, quite an interesting observation.
So obviously, when we go up to altitude, we see this physiological impact, and like you said, ultimately that leads to decreasing oxygen to the supplied muscles. So I guess my next question is then, what happens, when we go up there? Because what's the point in us going up high, suffering from a performance perspective? Is there some adaptive period? What happens within that? How long does that take?
Okay, again, a complex question, but let's keep it simple in a way. So we know that any ascent to altitude disrupts homeostasis physiologically. So the body has a very dynamic response to altitude, acute altitude exposure, and that involves more or less adaptations on all physiological systems that we have. But predominantly at the beginning, there's a response of an increased respiration and an increase of cardiac output. In a way, there's essentially heart rate goes up, ventilation goes up, etc. And this is just acutely because the body wants to restore the homeostasis or enable more oxygen to be delivered to the brain, to the active tissues, etc. But then if we're exposed for a longer periods of time, there are many other mechanisms that we know can lead to improved homeostasis, and in line also can in the long term improve endurance performance. Yeah, one of these factors, I mean, we can discuss many from an endurance performance perspective, is an increase in erythropoietin production by the renal function. Yeah? And then essentially you can get this hematological response. What you're aiming for is increasing hemoglobin, which we know is more or less directly connected to maximal oxygen uptake, which can translate into endurance performance. But again, I think it's important to note for the listeners, there are many versions or options of altitude training. I think for endurance athletes, the long duration exposures, calling them leaving high, training high, or leaving high, training low, are most popular. So the aiming at hematological adaptations and also others. So this is something that you need a certain amount of time to have it, obviously, to be effective. And I'm not saying it's easy, it's black or white, and we do altitude training, it will happen. And I think it's very nuanced, the responses, and we need to take into account the individual variability, which is really high. So what I always say is that you need to take it on an individual basis and monitor, what's going on. If you just put athletes into an altitude training like a black box, measure them afterwards, there's many factors that can influence that. So it's really important to really monitor it properly. And I think it's also at the beginning really important to emphasize that altitude training is just a form of additional training stimuli. Yeah, you shouldn't confuse it with the basic training. I think when you do proper basic training really well, then you should think about these added advantages. It's not in any way an exchange for normal, basic high quality training.
Yeah. So you mentioned there the changes in blood parameters or hematological parameters. Currently, do we see that is the main driver for going to altitude? We go to altitude, we adapt, that drives up EPO and changes the blood profile, and therefore we can theoretically perform better. Do we know if, as well as training up there, if we're spending long times, again, I don't want to complicate this more than it is for the listeners, because like you mentioned, there's different models of living high, training low, living high, training high, etc. But do we think we see any permanent physiological changes just from that additional stress? Because it's going to be more stressful for the body up there. If we're training the muscles with reduced or limited oxygen supply, are we driving more permanent adaptations there over time? Or is it purely we go up there for a period of time and we come down and there's a time that will dissipate?
Yeah, so let's start for the listeners, maybe more of an illustration. So if we go acutely for a few hours, obviously these effects are negligible, long term. And then on the other hand of the spectrum, we have populations or people who live constantly and are genetically adapted to high altitude, like people in the Andes, Sherpas in Nepal, etc. So they're there all the time and they have distinct phenotypical and genotypical adaptations to altitude. So they're completely adapted. Yeah. And then in between this acute adaptation and this genetic long term, there's a variety of adaptations that you can actually get. And we know, for example, if we look at the hematological effects, we know that more or less to get a relatively robust average increase in hemoglobin mass, you need to have individuals exposed to at least, let's say, 250 hours of altitude, which means, let's say, 10 days of constant exposure, or maybe like 18 to 20 days of exposure during the night and then doing some training down. And then here I would also like to mention, I think it's important that we have really good data to support the effects of residence at high altitude, that it induces hematological adaptations, because we know that there has to be a certain amount of time spent to increase hemoglobin mass in the end. Whereas on the other hand, just training in altitude, it's not really so clear what the effects are. And to be honest, I think overall the data shows that moderate to low intensity training in high altitude is not really something we should pursue more. There is a model of hypoxic training called repeated sprints training in hypoxia, which is high intensity intermittent training, where you can get some adaptation on a muscular level, like molecular levels. But I think from an endurance point of view, the main idea is to get a sufficient or long enough exposure time. And as we didn't mention it before, but we know that endurance athletes nowadays, I think that they're the best option of altitude training for them, or most popular, is the one combining as much as possible exposure to high altitude. So they sleep at high altitudes, and then they do most of the training actually at low altitudes, where they can achieve sufficient and similar mechanical load as those during normal training. So not to disrupt the training regime, but maybe re-up the benefits of hematological adaptations at altitude.
And there's a few places, we see quite a few of the pro cycling teams, there's Tenerife, where you can sleep up on the top of Mount TD, and Sierra Nevada, and I think from Ramu you can get down to the valley and utilize it that way. But that, again, I suppose there's limited areas for that. But just to finalize that, just going back to a point that you made around, there's high altitude researchers in, above 3,000 meters. What have you found over time that is kind of optimal for this? Because there's going to be a stress balance, isn't there, of them being able to train versus what the altitude is doing to the body.
Yeah, definitely. It's a really important distinction. I think in general, what you want to prevent is that the altitude where you reside disrupts the recovery. Yeah, and that usually happens when you are, let's say, if I were to say an optimal number now, just BAM, it would be around 2,300, 2,400 meters. Yeah. For me, it's obviously dependent individually, but what you need to prevent is that you disrupt sleep, more or less. Yeah, when sleep is disrupted, and we know that from high altitude research that above 3,000 meters, more or less, sleep is really bad. There's a lot of other issues along with acute mountain sickness or stuff like that can influence really well-being and recovery. So I think the main issue is that you prevent the problems with sleep. So you don't want to have problems with recovery, and that usually happens around somewhere there, 2,500. And it's also here, I think it's important to note that there's a cumulative effect of maintaining the same training and hypoxia exposure, which poses an additional metabolic stress. So you need to be really careful when you do this kind of training or with athletes, not to overburden them, not to put them in a state of overreaching or stuff like that. So it's you have to be really careful. That's why it's really important to monitor. And then just on this topic, I think it's also quite crucial to mention that obviously, and Tim mentioned that at the beginning, when you'll be competing at higher altitudes, so you have a summit competition, summit stage that finishes at 2,400 or something. So you obviously, it would be really unwise not to prepare for altitude, like this, So we call that a pre-acclimatization to altitude strategy, which is, we know that obviously it's good to be a bit acclimatized when you do altitude type of workouts or competitions, etc. So for altitude pre-preparation, altitude training is definitely a really wise thing to do. When you look at sea level performance, obviously there is more and more nuance, so it's a bit less clear. I'm sure that many athletes can get advantage, but again, it's individual. So for sea level performance, it's a bit less clear, how beneficial that is. But please, the listeners should bear in mind that when they know they'll be exposed to high altitudes, it's a no-brainer to prepare. Yeah.
It's in a similar fashion to, as you'll be familiar with, acclimatizing for climbing mountains. You can't just go to the top. You have to go through a protocol to allow the body to adjust before you can then go that bit.
I mean,
further.
yeah, it's the same thing. And I think in sports, like environmental scenarios, it's the same with heat. Yeah. We know that we can really nicely adapt to heat. And I'm still, by analysis, still many athletes or cyclists or, endurance athletes do not prepare for heat, or they're not heat adapted. And we know now things are getting, the world is warming, and it's really, so we know that this is obviously great. Whereas again, for sea level performance or, even temperate conditions in the heat, it's a bit less, I think, clear cut decision on that.
Yeah. So, I mean, in essence, is a stimulus. And just to summarize what you've just said is that we don't want to be disrupting that training pattern, because ultimately, there's no point in us being up there if we can't go and train. If we're too fatigued, training goes down, it's almost an opposing situation to what we want. We want to be able to train. We want that bit of extra stimulus from that over time. To be able to adapt to that. So it's a real important thing to think about the context and how people approach that when they are perhaps going to do camps like this. I'm just going to jump to Tim now, just on, I suppose, physiological side. Like, are there any changes that happen when we go up to there from a substrate perspective? And we'll go into a bit of nutritional influence later on. But, do we see changes in how we utilize carbohydrates, fats, as we go up to altitude?
Well, the most important thing from this, to answer this question, is that, as the performance goes down, this means that our thresholds, physiological thresholds, kind of get reduced. So if your first lactate threshold at normal altitude is 250 watts, and at altitude might be at 220 watts. So if you were to go up the mountain at the same absolute power, this would mean that you would be obviously at altitude working at a higher relative power output, and this would then require more carbohydrates, just as a matter of different relative intensities. But if you were to exercise the same relative intensity, which means if you adjusted your thresholds based on the effects of altitude, then I think the percentage of energy coming from either carbohydrates or fats would be very similar. At least this is, I think, what research is showing. I don't think here we see massive differences. I think heat has more profound effects on metabolism and substrate oxidation than altitude. But there are some suggestions. Just for instance, at altitude, we also see a decrease in utilization of ingested carbohydrates. But again, this would be at really high altitudes. Most evidence comes from 4,000 meters or something like that. So which is not something we would see in a daily lives of normal athletes. But there are definitely changes. I wanted to actually go back and ask today something which is would be probably very applicable to many listeners, and this is his opinion on altitude tents and just sleeping in simulated altitudes, and how this would benefit or not the adaptations, or whether this would be similar to residing at altitude.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Yeah, it's a great question. We should address that at the beginning in a way, because we know that we can do altitude training in let's say two basic scenarios. So one is we reside up the mountain, and the other one is actually to use altitude tents or altitude rooms, etc., where we normally utilize just reduction in the fraction of inspired oxygen as opposed to reduction in pressure. So instead of reducing the pressure, we reduce the fraction of inspired oxygen to gauge or to target the same partial pressure of oxygen in the air. And we've done, and there's been a lot of work done on the comparing these two models of hypoxia. And I was fortunate to collaborate with Professor Grégoire Millet from Lausanne, where we also did a lot of this work comparing these two effects. And a short answer could be that altitude tents or altitude rooms can really be useful for altitude adaptation. There is some evidence to suggest that the impulse is a bit lower at the same partial pressure because of the partial pressure of oxygen, because the ambient pressure plays a bit of a role. But from an applied side of things, I believe strongly that you can easily implement similar induce similar effects using the normobaric so-called, so that means the simulated hypoxia, and it has some very good advantages, in particular that if you have a team of athletes going to high altitude, they're all exposed to same altitude, and for some it might be a bit high, for some it might be a bit low, and when you utilize normobaric hypoxia or altitude rooms, you can adjust the actual altitudes within the rooms, so you can play a bit more, adapt or change it over time. So it's really more individualized. And I think that using like altitude training centers like this, where they have normobaric hypoxic rooms, and there are quite a few around. We have one in Slovenia or two, and there's around Europe, there's quite a few. I think it's really good. Whereas on the topic of altitude tents, I'm not really a big proponent of tents, because tents are mostly aimed at applying hypoxia during sleep, which is nice, and from a physiological perspective it's good. But we have experience also with athletes, and when using this for research purposes, there's a lot of actual sleep disturbance. People don't sleep really well in the tents. I would say half of the people are really uncomfortable with being in a closed tent. So I think utilizing an hypoxic room where you apply hypoxic air into a room, normal room or etc., is really good, and it's not really disturbing from that perspective, air recovery. Whereas hypoxic tents, I think you need to be really motivated and a good sleeper to use it really well. That's my opinion. But from a physiological point of view, you can always rehab the benefits by using tents. Yeah? But I would really suggest it's using rooms is much better. I think much more convenient in a performance scenario.
It's interesting because you kind of beat me to that question, Tim. So thank you for bringing that up. But here in the UK, we're not graced, with high mountains or opportunities to do that. So really, that only exists in Europe and outside of that. And it actually takes me back. It was actually over COVID time, like quite a lot of years. I went and raced the World Winter Triathlon Champs, but it was in Andorra up at 2,200 meters. And we were in COVID time, so, I really didn't have a lot of access to anything, but it just made me think about how people may prepare, certainly from locations that don't have that. It's quite a privileged opportunity to go spend 2-3 weeks up at an altitude camp, and we know professional setups have the budget to do that, but the general listeners might have other avenues. So in the UK, I know a number of places where there are altitude rooms. There's altitude generators where you can sit with a mask on. There's altitude tents, as you suggested there. And yeah, again, bringing that question up of whether those are effective. My question goes back to that you mentioned earlier, when we got to altitude, we want exposure for a period of time, maybe 250 hours. If we're, say, using tents, breathers, rooms, are we going to take the same approach to that? For people who have access to an altitude room, I think, is it time of exposure that we want to spend in there? Or is it a case of getting small doses, getting a bit of stimulus, coming away, recovering? Do we know anything around that?
Yeah, so it's a great question again, and it goes to the complexity of training modalities and stuff. at Altitude because we have many, but I think if there's an individual who wants to get hematological adaptations, so there's no other way around it than to have a significant amount of hypoxic dose, at the right dose. So that means you need to have prolonged exposures because you need to induce repeated increases in erythropoietin hormone, which stimulates red blood cells production, and that in the end leads to increases in hemoglobin mass. We also, on the other hand, as I mentioned before, we have some, we call it hypoxic training, where you do different types of training under hypoxic condition, which is for a performance scenario. I think for high performance sport, I don't think it's really useful, except for maybe repeated sprints training in hypoxia. Other modalities are not really that great, but on the other hand, it has a big added value potentially in more clinical populations, where if I touch upon Tim's comment on the relative and absolute work rates, so what we can do with hypoxia during training is actually increase the metabolic demand or metabolic intensity with reduced mechanical load, which is more or less can be important for clinical populations, or it has maybe a good application in rehabilitation in musculoskeletal injuries. And then one of the PhD students in our lab, Benjamin Nduranz from UK, just published a paper on utilizing hypoxic training for kind of musculoskeletal rehabilitation, which is also good. And also, since we're on the topic, just to mention, there's also quite a lot of work being done on using systemic hypoxia for resistance training, for hypertrophy, etc., like this. But my feeling is, I mean, there's various results, but I think that for when using systemic, so breathing hypoxic mixture during strength training, I don't think it has a really beneficial effect. So there's limitation to activation and stuff. So I don't think that's really useful. Whereas on the other hand, local application like blood flow restriction training, that's local hypoxia, that might be of interest, but I think, you need to utilize it well.
Okay. And it's like it is interesting to look at those perspectives, and you've got highly trained populations, general populations, and maybe those, special groups that might help from a clinical perspective. And I certainly know some of my area of work, and my supervisor, Dr. Richard McKenzie, has done work in hypoxia and insulin resistance, and improvements in that. So, these things can utilize a lot of things, and I know we're talking about sports performance here, but they can be beneficial for general population as well. So, it's good to understand that, because it's good for the listeners to know what perhaps the limitations are of the different methods of either going to altitude, using tents, and using this, and ultimately as well it comes down to that disruption, as you mentioned. No point in having a tent if you're not sleeping, and your training quality is going to go down. So I suppose, just to kind of round that off, what are the things that we talk about the benefits here that can happen, but we also need to be a bit mindful of the approach, things that might not happen or cause detriment to performance. Do we see that? And, what are the things to watch out for?
Yeah, so we definitely see that altitude training, like classical living high training low, doesn't work for everybody. And when we measure like hemoglobin mass pre-post, there's a really wide variety of individual responses. So we know it's not really a black and white answer. It works for everybody and works for not. It's really hard to pinpoint what the reasons are for that, because we don't really have a good marker or a test of individuals' responses. Because also from the teams and coaches, they often ask, okay, so how can we predict what will happen? So should we do it with this guy or, this rider or whatever? So it's really tricky to predict. But I think we can tease out, I think usually it goes either it's an overload of combined training and hypoxic exposure, which, as we mentioned before, can lead to overreaching, overtraining, etc. I think one really important aspect is that maybe some athletes come to altitude not in perfect health. Maybe they have a small issue with that, and then that obviously disrupts the whole process. So there's also a really important nutritional consideration. I mean, Tim is more an expert on that, but we know that, for example, if we have individuals, and here particularly female are more prone to that, who don't have a good iron reserve or iron stores in the body, that can be a big issue when implementing altitude training. And this is one of the basic rules you follow. You ensure that all of the athletes that are going to altitude are sufficiently not iron depleted. So we supplement irons to make sure. It's not as easy as it sounds, but it's something that you need to do, because we know that these hematological effects are quite demanding on the iron stores. So this is really important, and I think from a general perspective on the training, you just need to ensure that they have sufficient recovery, so not to overdo it on the hypoxic altitude, that they ingest sufficient amount of carbohydrates for the work that they required in a way, so what they need. I don't think you should go overboard, but just to maintain that they're not depleted of any energy, and just maintain, I think, a normal nutritional guidelines should be followed there, and if you have somebody who has sufficient iron, eats well, recovers well, more or less it should be fine. It's really an interesting observation that it's also sometimes for the athletes it works really well, sometimes not that well, so it's hard to say, what was the difference now. So I think it's really tricky, and I always try to tell also the athletes and the coaches that you shouldn't just expect, okay, this 5% will be better or something. But I think in general, like these training camps, even altitude, they also have a factor of placebo, so a training camp effect, and Tim already mentioned. It's also something not to neglect in a way. But obviously, given the financial and logistical challenges that you're faced with when you want to do a proper altitude training, you need to wait a bit, the pros and cons there.
Yeah. So I think, great insight, and it does highlight that whilst we also have individual responses to this, and I've experienced this myself, climbing with groups and things, and people get different responses at different times, but that individual response is also important to monitor if you're considering that. But actually being in the right state and being prepared, to me sounds like it's almost just as important, because again, some of that individual response, let's say we take a group of people that have gone up there, some are not adapting so well, that could potentially be some of those underlying factors, not the actual altitude. Like you say, if iron stores or, they're not great, if we come in fatigued, a bit too much fatigued, actually are those some of the driving factors as well. So for anyone who's considering that, actually the basics are right. Am I in a good condition and well prepared? I've got, I've maybe checked my bloods for iron before I consider it and make it worthwhile doing. Am I right to say that?
Fair enough. I think it's a fair point. Yeah, it's definitely, I think you need to take into account the added strain of altitude, and make sure that you don't overdo it. Yeah. I think in a way it's tricky to maintain exactly the same training throughout, and I always suggest maybe, during the first few days, take it easy, do a bit of monitoring of maybe heart rate variability, or, a bit of saturation monitoring, which is really non-invasive and easy to do, just to see how things are developing, and then up both the training impulse as well as potentially the altitude if you do it in the rooms where you can easily manipulate.
Yes, I was going to ask you that. Is that the same approach if we say we're going to do some sessions in an altitude room, or an altitude generator, even an altitude tent? We take the same approach in being prepared for this additional stress to make sure that it's effective in the way that we want, because they're slightly different I assume that we want to take that approach as well.
Yeah, most definitely. I think gradually is the way to go. In to kick it off, to make sure that you don't overdo it. It's better to ease off a bit for the first few days. And again, I think it all boils down to monitoring. Yeah, and that's also, if the athlete or the coach or whoever, so you need to monitor yourself or an individual to make sure that it's not too much. Yeah. And this is not it's hard to just say, okay, everything can be scientific. I think also the athletes, subjective feeling, you should take it a bit, not more into account, but take care of it to make sure if he says or she says, oh, I'm not feeling great, then obviously we should reduce a bit. I think also the subjective feelings are quite important in this regard. Yeah, you can't just pinpoint everything to some numbers.
And maybe a nice approach then is like you're saying, that first period, those 3-4 days is actually using perceived effort or RPE as part of that, rather than going up there and thinking about numbers and paces, if you're running or cycling, and actually just feeling your way into it, and then maybe gradually introduce it. But I mean, we all know that RPE can be quite effective as well, even even around power values. So it's really good that you mentioned about the iron stores, because I was going to move on to the nutritional aspects as well, and that was going to be a question for Tim in terms of do we need to monitor iron? Do we need to be careful because there's, hematological changes that might affect? What other things might we want to consider outside of, I suppose, fueling for the work required? You mentioned there might be that increase in energy expenditure or utilization of carbohydrates. What's your view on if I were to go and say, right, I'm going to go do an altitude camp, or I'm going to do some sessions, what things do I want to think about nutritionally?
Well, I think keeping energy balance is crucial to basically get the adaptations that you are after. I kind of view altitude training camp as a way to either A, lose body mass, or B, increase hemoglobin mass. Like there's like, they just probably usually don't go really well together. You can go have either. And if you actually listen to some of the athletes, they would say, oh yeah, I love going to the altitude training camp because this way I lose body mass. And they're not really interested in increasing the work, power output. And you have athletes that would be weighing every gram to make sure that they don't lose body mass or stay in energy balance, and then they can actually improve the power output and improve performance. And you can have both at the same time. So yeah, one of the things that is kind of debatable, I guess, at moderate altitude is whether you kind of suppress the appetite, but at high altitude you there is evidence that appetite can be suppressed. And when the athletes are in altitude environment, living away from home, not having access to the fridge all the time, and so on and so forth, they can actually reduce the amount of food they're having. And this means that they can very easily either lose weight or basically be in energy deficit and not recover as well. And recovery at altitude, when you're residing at altitude, is crucial. And if you just add the stress of high altitude and energy deficit, you just will not recover well. So I think this is kind of the most important thing, apart from just having sufficient iron stores and supplementing with iron all the time and before as well. So yeah, when athletes that I work with go to the altitude training camp, we monitor nutrition as closely or as precisely as we do during races, whereas when they're at home, we leave them be and just they can be more relaxed. But at altitude, it really, really is important.
And I think that, from a general principle perspective, it's applicable to sea level in a way that, if you're not fueling appropriately, not only for the training load and the training stimulus, and you're not recovering, then there's going to be a performance decrement there. And I suppose that just applies to a high altitude environment. You've just got a little bit more physiological stress going on at the time.
Yeah, but the problem is that like athletes are going to the training camps like say like 4 or 5 weeks before the competition, and this is when they start thinking, oh, I want to reduce the body mass a bit more because I'm just didn't follow the plan, and I really need to reduce the body mass by 1 kilo or 2 kilos now in 4 weeks, which is kind of, yeah, that would make sense in a normal scenario when you wouldn't go to the altitude, but now you're going to the altitude, so you really need to decide you're going to the altitude to do what. And I've seen this with athletes pretty common, and I always say, well, we are not reducing your body mass. Like, you haven't done your homework before, we can't change it now because the coach will not be happy because you will be underperforming, and you will do more harm than good. So, yeah, always think ahead and don't use altitude as a mean to reduce body mass. Um, you can reduce body mass, yeah, more in a cheaper way, but just residing at home.
So, I mean, yeah, basic principles apply again. It's just ensuring we're fueling appropriately for the training that we're going to be doing up there, and be mindful that there might be some changes in the environment, as in, you're not at home. The altitude may have some suppression around appetite. So I suppose a little bit of closer monitoring, a bit of nuance around that will just help keep you in check and making sure that you are doing everything you can to basically get the purpose of altitude out the other side of it. So, yeah, it's fascinating on how those two interact. So, I suppose just to round it up, then we'll go to Tadej first. And let's look from a general perspective. What are, for the listeners out there, and some that might be thinking about going to an altitude camp, might be using altitude room. What are kind of the three main things that we want to be thinking about, I suppose, before going into that?
Yeah, so I think, as we mentioned before, I think it's important that we ensure that the athletes are healthy before they go. That we need to think of what we want to achieve with the altitude training, and I here like to echo Tim. Yeah, there's a lot of this uh, aim of losing body mass during altitude training, but this is something that we really shouldn't encourage. Yeah, I think it's not the best way. It happens, as I mentioned before, but I think we should discourage this with athletes, because then the performance side of things is really not there, what you want to achieve. And if you go to altitude, to improve performance, then this is not the best way to go. And I know that it happens because there's this anorexic effect a bit and overall, but I think this is quite crucial. And then, so if we know what we want to achieve, we need to ensure, maybe thirdly, to have the sufficient hypoxic dose. So in this scenario that we were speaking, at least, let's say, 250 hours of exposure for hematological responses. And I think I'll go with a fourth point, is that essentially I think monitoring is crucial at altitude. Yeah, because if you don't monitor it, it's like a black box. You never know what's going to happen. So there are some strategies to monitor and to help. And I think this should be implemented wherever that's feasible.
Yeah, fantastic. And Tim, from your side as well, from a nutritional perspective, what what are your top three things that we want to ensure or think about either going into or at altitude if we're going to do such a camp?
Well, definitely like go 3 weeks before to a lab to test your ferritin status, see what it is. Make sure it's probably above 60, 70, definitely not below, and start supplementing with iron like 100 milligrams a day, or like follow some other specific guidelines from a nutritionist. And then when you're at altitude, like really make sure that you go there and you're healthy, and you basically have a varied diet and have enough protein, have enough micronutrients, and just eat, high quality food, and fuel for the work required just otherwise, but just be a bit more careful, spend less time on Instagram, and spend more time planning your food.
A great tip for life there, in general. But like, thank you for that. And Tadej, I'm sure we could just talk for hours and hours more about this stuff. But we really, really appreciate your time for coming on today. And we hope the listeners have found it super interesting. I found it super interesting. But thank you again for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks. It was a great chat as always. Yeah, and thanks for the invitation.
Amazing. And for our listeners, we hope that you enjoyed it. We hope there were some take homes for this, or just some general information. So thank you for listening, and we'll see you soon.